In my sophomore year, from the first moment I saw him, I knew that I wasn't willing to just stop at saying, hello. However, when it came to falling in love after marriage, he could only manage the first two words. After making a wish, I was reborn. I was reborn before the wedding, but got stuck right after the wedding night. The same scene. It repeated over and over again until I said to my mother, I want to break up with him. A slap landed on my face. I fell onto the sofa, my face numb and my ears ringing. It seemed that only at this moment did I return to reality. Are you really determined to make me mad to be satisfied? Hey, let's talk it over calmly. Finally, my mother was pulled away. I stared at the familiar furnishings and subconsciously raised my head. Atticus came downstairs unhurriedly, as if he had just watched a joke, and looked down at me condescendingly. Don't always make unreasonable troubles. No one has the obligation to spoil you all the time, understand? I lowered my eyes, nervously picked at my fingers, and made my final farewell. Let's break up. Cancel the wedding banquet at the end of the year too. After a long silence, I looked up. In my vision, his appearance remained unchanged. He just gave a light chuckle and said, as you like. This was the answer he gave. It was within my expectation, but I was still easily hurt. Rebirth was a rare beginning, but I was trapped in memories again and couldn't extricate myself. The night grew deeper. Only a small lamp was on in the living room. I curled up on the sofa, shuddered, opened my eyes to look at my phone with no reply, and vaguely heard the sound of the door opening upstairs. Madam still not asleep? The nanny asked softly. I was stunned when I saw her coming out of the study with a cup of coffee. Is Atticus back? The nanny was a bit confused. He's been back for a long time and has been in the study all along. Me. Suddenly, I didn't know what to say. I hurriedly walked towards the study, knocked on the door, and gently pushed it open. Atticus was leaning on the chair and glanced at me. What's the matter? As indifferent as always. I clutched my phone and said in a low voice, Atticus, I think I'm pregnant. As soon as the words were out, I looked at him expectantly, hoping that he could show a bit of joy. However, all I got was an oh. Oh? I froze on the spot, not knowing how long I had stood there. It was midsummer, but I felt a chill that I had never felt before. The sound of fingers tapping on the table came. I watched silently, my eyes turning red. That was a sign of his impatience. It seemed that only at this time did I realize that from the beginning to the end, I was the only one who was indulged in this relationship and couldn't free myself. Atticus, do you like me? Atticus, let's get divorced. Atticus. Before I could finish my words, his figure had disappeared. Even one more minute of communication was a waste of time for him. This marriage was like still water with only slight ripples. He didn't love me. Marrying me was more like fulfilling a task when he reached a certain age. I felt like I had fallen into a cage. I regarded divorce as a way to free myself, not knowing that the interests of the two families had already been intertwined because of this marriage. And I was the bond. On that snowy day, I stood under the wishing tree, holding the red ribbon in my hands and crying uncontrollably. Your question is very boring. Serafina, I don't like others throwing tantrums at me. If you want to be Mrs. Atticus, then continue. If not, it's up to you. As soon as the words were out, the alarm clock rang more and more urgently. I shuddered and woke up from the dream. Looking at the simple furnishings in the room, I choked up. Fortunately, I was reborn. For a whole week. Without pestering Atticus, I had more free time. I was busy running around for internship interviews all day long. However, after going around a lot, I still hadn't found one. I was so tired that I sat on the edge of the flower bed and silently counted my little savings. Miss Serafina. The assistant recognized me at a glance. Atticus was sitting in the car, glancing at me. That kind of look. I was so familiar with it. It was a pity that I only understood it after getting married back then. Every time I tried to get his attention, he always looked at me like that, as if looking at a pet begging for pity. Atticus, throwing tantrums should also have a limit. When the message came, I lowered my head, stared at that line of words, and without hesitation, deleted him directly, along with those past chat records that were like a licking dog's. The next second, I looked up at Atticus and saw that he was holding his phone. His face suddenly changed, and he looked at me sharply. This was not a place to stay long. Serafina, there's an internship position here. The teacher asked you to give it a try. When the class committee member came to me, I was a bit excited. However, looking at the logo of the Atticus family group on the work permit, I felt a lump in my throat. There were plenty of jobs. I didn't want the one beside him. It just seemed that the point of my rebirth was to make me suffer the consequences of my own actions. I stood alone on the roadside, facing the expired recruitment fair posters. Sister, looking for an internship? I was worried, but when I saw Aurelius, a junior from the same department, my eyes lit up and I smiled at him. After all, we were acquaintances. I was too lazy to pretend and just nodded helplessly. The time isn't right. Hey, it's because I'm not serious about my studies. I missed it. Aurelius. I just casually joked with him, but unexpectedly, he found an internship interview opportunity for me. In the final round of the interview, I couldn't hide my excitement and stood nervously at the door of the office. It was my first time coming here, so I was a bit nervous. When the door opened, I became even more nervous. What came into view was not the boss, but Atticus. Me. If I hadn't checked that the boss was called Cassiu, I really would have wanted to slip away at this moment. Atticus was leaning on the sofa, his long legs crossed, with the same arrogant posture as always. Only when he casually caught sight of me out of the corner of his eye did he seem a bit stunned. At the moment of eye contact, it was like a spark. I immediately lowered my head and could only comfort myself that there might be a bug in rebirth. Fortunately, Atticus had a cold face throughout and didn't say a word. I passed. I excitedly stood at the door and excitedly called Aurelius. Turning around to look at the hall of the company, the words on the tip of my tongue got stuck instantly. Atticus was standing not far away. There was no sign of joy or anger on his face, but it was certain that he was staring at me. Sister? Junior let me treat you to dinner. I quickly turned around and said to the phone. Aurelius smiled. Hey, there's a company dinner to welcome new employees. Let's go together. As it turned out, Aurelius was also in this company. At the first company dinner, I couldn't hide my joy, but I never expected that Atticus would also come. For about half a minute, the seat beside him was still empty. Many people wanted to sit beside him, but they were all more polite than the other. I was really afraid that they would push back and forth and finally it would fall on me. Don't be shy. Sit. Cassiu clicked his tongue and signaled a colleague to sit beside Atticus, and then looked over again. I was immediately scared and didn't dare to make a sound, thinking about hiding behind. In the end, Cassiu glanced at me and then at Aurelius. You two are the new interns, right? What are you waiting for? You two can sit there. Okay. I quickly responded and almost dragged Aurelius to sit beside me to avoid changing seats again. Aurelius raised his eyebrows and let me pull at his clothes. Meeting the smile in his eyes, my heart trembled slightly and I immediately let go, saying in a low voice, sorry. It's okay. Sister, just pull a little lighter next time. I bit my lip, really feeling shy. Aurelius was very considerate and always maintained a gentle attitude, and from time to time, he would pick up food for me. I was having a great time eating and unconsciously chatted more and more with him in whispers. Serafina, stop chatting and toast quickly. I was chatting enthusiastically with Aurelius when a colleague beside me poked me and gave me a look. I was a bit confused. Toast? To whom? Who do you think? The colleague frowned slightly. I hesitantly looked at Atticus and found that he was looking at me with cold eyes. Me, Mr. Liano. Some people around had already stood up holding wine glasses and toasting to Atticus, saying a lot of nice words. I felt embarrassed listening to them, but it seemed that everyone enjoyed it except Atticus. When others drank wine, he drank tea instead. He was so calm, as if everything should be like this. He was just the person sitting in the honored seat, just nodding slightly and smiling, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Serafina. The colleague poked me again. I didn't really want to stand up, but Aurelius seemed to see through me and said softly, "Toast together?" I hesitated for a long time and thought it would be nice to have someone accompany me, so I picked up my wine glass and stood up together, learning from what Aurelius said and expressing so-called respect to Atticus. The younger generation is full of promise. Keep working hard. Atticus put his hand on the table, as if casually tapping on the table, picked up the cup slightly and took a sip. I was also relieved, but I didn't know what others thought. Suddenly, someone joked, "They two look quite a match. The height difference. So cute." Surprisingly, Cassio also joined in the fun. "Indeed, they really do match well. Brother, right?" As soon as the words were out, Atticus started coughing violently, as if he had been choked by the tea, and his face turned red. "Mr. Liano, are you okay?" The atmosphere became tense all of a sudden. Cassio was also quite scared and couldn't help complaining, "How can you choke on tea?" Atticus frowned, grasped a tissue in his hand, looking particularly painful, with a bit of tears in the corners of his eyes, looking especially pitiful. "Go to the hospital and have a look," I couldn't help saying when I saw that Atticus didn't look well. Atticus looked at me and suddenly put on a calm look and said softly, "I'm okay." "Me? Are you really okay? You're pretending when you're clearly not okay." I couldn't help glaring at him, but after living together for 3 years, looking at his reaction, I was quite sure that he was feeling very uncomfortable at the moment. "Hey, it's okay. Just take it easy." Cassio was a bit drunk, his cheeks flushed. He took a look at me and smiled. "The little girl is quite enthusiastic." I was stunned for a moment and then realized that my eyes were too intense. Immediately, I restrained my gaze. Not long after, Atticus found an excuse and went out. "Sister, are you very familiar with Mr. Liano?" Aurelius asked tentatively. I forced a smile and said softly, "Not really." Until the banquet ended, Atticus didn't show up. I turned my head and saw that Aurelius was quite drunk. I stopped a car on the roadside and decided to send him back to school. Unexpectedly, as soon as the car approached and I saw the license plate, I regretted it. However, Aurelius had already got into the car. After reporting the school's address, I closed the car door and remained silent. The light inside the car was dim. Atticus sat there, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his voice hoarse as he said, "Hugging and cuddling with someone who's neither a relative nor a friend." He was drunk. I vaguely sensed the sarcasm in his words, but I could only pretend to be stupid and replied casually. I helped Aurelius sit up straight, unscrewed the bottle of apple cider vinegar I took from the hotel, and fed him some more. The car suddenly started moving. The bottle in my hand shook, and the liquid almost spilled out. I looked at Atticus in the front seat, wanting to scold him, but I held back. After drinking some apple cider vinegar, Aurelius felt much better. He rubbed his forehead in a daze, looked at me quietly, and said softly, "Thank you, sister." "You're welcome. Are you still feeling uncomfortable?" Looking at the soft and cute appearance of this kid, I couldn't help feeling a bit helpless. He was really silly and didn't know how to avoid drinking at all. Aurelius blinked his eyes, looked at me quietly, and said softly, "Sister, I have something to tell you." What is it?" Seeing that he was quite drunk, I held his arm and asked tentatively. Aurelius turned his head to look at me, a smile curving his lips. Against the passing lights on the roadside, his smile was rather bright. "Sister, I like you." "What?" I was a bit surprised and even suspected that I had misheard. But Aurelius was very serious and repeated, "Serafina, I like you." As soon as the words fell, the car suddenly stopped, and the whole compartment instantly felt as cold as an ice cellar. The car stopped so abruptly that Aurelius, who hadn't sat firmly, bumped right into my arms. "Atticus, do you even know how to drive?" I was really speechless. The faint fragrance on the young man's body wafted over, and I felt like my heart almost stopped for a moment. I awkwardly helped Aurelius sit up straight. Atticus had a cold expression on his face and said in a deep voice, "You come and sit in the front." "I don't want to." I refused directly. "Atticus, then both of you get out of the car." My head was buzzing. I really couldn't stand Atticus's attitude when he spoke. I held Aurelius and was about to open the door. "Get out then, get out." However, even though I said that, I couldn't open the door. With a gloomy face, Atticus stepped on the accelerator to the floor. He managed to arrive 10 minutes earlier for a journey that usually took half an hour. When the light inside the car was turned on, I was about to help Aurelius get out of the car, but unexpectedly, Atticus opened the door, got out of the car, called the security guard over, and directly dragged Aurelius away. There's the security guard to send him. You don't need to worry." Atticus leaned on the car door, looking at me with a gloomy face, as if he had suffered great. Such an expression was quite rare. "How much is the fare? Let's talk." "I don't want to talk." I immediately refused. "Every time we talk, I'm always the one who's wrong. I can't win an argument with you." Atticus was momentarily at a loss for words and then asked sternly, "Are you really Seraphina?" I was slightly stunned. Without changing my expression, I immediately replied, "Could it be fake?" However, no matter what, he would never have thought that the me in front of him had been married to him for 3 years. Atticus's eyes flickered slightly, and he said word by word, "You're different from her. She wasn't as disobedient as you. She wouldn't delete my account, let alone mention breaking up." What Atticus said seemed like a complaint, and his eyes seemed to want to see through me. Whether there's a change or not, people change. I frowned, looked at him, and hurriedly interrupted him. "Besides, all the obedience in front of you was just an act. I had to pretend to be obedient so that you would pay attention to me. But in that case, what's the difference between me and a cat or a dog?" Atticus stared at me, hesitated several times as if he wanted to say something. In the past, I might have been excited and looked forward to his words, but I couldn't let my love-struck brain from my previous life continue into this life. My eyes felt a bit sour. I stood up and walked to the car door, pushed him away. "Atticus, I know you're just not used to me suddenly being disobedient. But I'm tired. To be honest, I couldn't even tell whether I was sad because of being neglected during the 3 years of marriage or because I cared too much about him. However, none of this mattered anymore. It was time for things between him and me to come to an end. Time seemed to be fragmented by work. Cassio didn't play by the rules and asked the interns to form groups and work on the planning for small companies separately. It would have been okay if it was just the planning for small companies. But this planning happened to be about love, and I felt a bit tired. "Sister." I suddenly came back to my senses and smiled slightly. "Thank you." Aurelius handed me the brewed tea and looked at me tentatively, saying in a low voice, "Sister, I drank too much last time. I hope I didn't cause you any trouble." I held the cup tightly, pretended to be calm, and said softly, "No, you were quite obedient." Aurelius looked a bit disappointed. I lowered my eyes, pretending not to see it. I knew very well that it would take some time for a heart that had experienced the ups and downs to return to its original state. I think the boss wants to play matchmaker between the 2 interns. He arranges for them to do everything together. Ha ha ha, I feel the same way. I felt a bit at a loss when I heard that and trotted back to my workstation. There was a bouquet of roses on the table. Wow, the boss is so generous. He even knows to send flowers on festivals. I was stunned for a moment and then realized that there was a bouquet of roses on everyone's table, regardless of gender. The first bouquet of flowers in my life came from the boss. "Sister, do you like it?" I held the bouquet of roses, gently touched the petals, and said with a smile, "Of course I like it." Ha ha ha, Aurelius has good taste. He chose nice flowers. A colleague suddenly interrupted. "You chose them?" I was stunned for a moment. Facing Aurelius's earnest gaze, I silently put the flowers back on the table and said softly, "Nice choice." Aurelius looked at me, silently moved his gaze away, and said in a low voice, "It's just for the project planning to do some research and see if everyone likes roses. Sister, don't you want to take a closer look?" I clenched my hands, nodded, and pinched the wrapping paper of the bouquet. Roses. They symbolize passionate love. After several days, my mother called. I summoned up my courage several times before daring to answer the call, but unexpectedly, there was only one sentence. "Come back for dinner on the weekend. Do you hear me?" I was afraid that my mother would be tough on me, but I was even more afraid that she would be soft. She said that she would cook by herself and make the dishes that I liked. However, the truth was that she had invited Atticus to our home. "Can't we just have instant noodles? Do we have to make sliced noodles?" I muttered softly. My mother served the noodles, glanced at me, and said earnestly, "Don't always act like a child. You're just an intern now and don't know the hardships of work. Atticus is so busy every day. How can he have time to put up with your tantrums?" I lowered my eyes, looked at the steaming hot noodles, and mumbled softly, "But no matter how busy Dad was, he would still buy you flowers." My mother was stunned for a moment. I pouted and looked at her. "Mom, I'm so envious of you." My mother looked at me in surprise and said, "You silly child, what are you thinking about? Can't Atticus afford to buy you flowers? Hurry up and take the bowl to Atticus." This was really ineffective communication. What you ask for and what someone buys for you voluntarily are different, aren't they? I held the bowl, turned around, looked at Atticus standing at the door, met his cold gaze, and silently looked away. "Atticus, Serafina is still young. Hey, honey, let's eat while it's hot." My father interrupted at the right time. I kept my head down all the time, pretending that I was just there to eat. To avoid an argument, under my mother's gaze, I got into Atticus's car. "I'll just take the bus from here." I took the opportunity to unbuckle my seatbelt, trying not to say anything unnecessary. Atticus looked straight ahead and drove past the bus stop as if he hadn't heard me. The car stopped at a flower shop near the school. Before I could react, the clerk had already come over with a fresh bouquet of roses and handed it to me. "Miss Serafina, here are your flowers." I didn't buy any flowers. I was at a loss and didn't know whether I should take them or not. "Atticus, I bought them." This was the first time he had given me flowers. No, to be precise. It should be said that it was the first time he gave me a gift without going through his assistant. The assistant was paid to do things, so naturally, he took care of everything and wouldn't miss any meaningful occasion. But Atticus probably couldn't remember any of these occasions. Looking at the bouquet of flowers, I felt a mixture of emotions in an instant, and mostly I was touched. However, the next second, Atticus tapped his fingers on the steering wheel and said casually, "Besides flowers, what else do you want? Just tell me all at once." As soon as the words fell, I looked at him in astonishment, clenched the bouquet in my hand, and almost without hesitation, threw it at him. "Who cares about your flowers?" I threw the flowers, slammed the car door, and walked away angrily. "Come on, you even stood me up before because of him." My childhood friend Opal had an expression that seemed to say she understood everything. Sleeping with him and then breaking up? Could it be? I bit my lip and pushed her. Don't worry about this. Just think that I was too love-struck before." I lowered my head and flipped through the project information, feeling a bit embarrassed. "Damn." Opal was shocked. "Well, Serafina, when did you become so self-aware?" To be honest, people with a love-struck brain rarely have a clear understanding. They usually only realize that they will really get hurt badly when they hit the wall head-on. Atticus. Every choice he made was from the perspective of interests, for the so-called grand plan he talked about. I could understand it, but I couldn't accept it. Especially every time when I imagined that if I were an ordinary person without any family background, he would probably just regard me as an insignificant ant. The night was getting darker and shrouded the courtyard. I was a bit sleepy, but then I heard a sound of footsteps behind me. When I turned around, I saw a familiar figure. It was Atticus. As always, he stood out in the crowd. That cold and aloof temperament was probably one of the reasons why I was so fascinated by him at first. Serafina. Opal hurriedly walked over, grabbed me, and whispered, "Let's get out of here." I saw that group of people walking towards us. I felt flustered and also planned to avoid them, but I was in such a hurry that my mobile phone dropped to the ground with a click. Everyone's eyes turned towards us. Some people's eyes lit up, and some were confused. Only Atticus remained calm. "Ivan, is this your sister? Let's go have dinner together." I wanted to refuse, but since Ivan invited us, Opal and I were dragged to the dinner table like this. Compared to the people present, Opal and I were relatively young. But once these men got drunk and started chatting, their topics became wild. "I heard that Lao Zhang has a really pretty mistress." "Really? What's he like? Do you have a photo?" "A video would be okay too." Suddenly, I felt a bit embarrassed. As an older brother, Ivan also looked troubled when he heard this, but he didn't dare to interrupt easily. "There are children around." Atticus suddenly spoke up. After all, when he spoke, it was more effective. The expressions of the several men changed slightly, and then they all immediately laughed, quickly apologized, and changed the topic. I quietly looked up at him, only to find that he was also looking at me. I immediately lowered my head, stuffed a big mouthful of food into my mouth, pretending that I had hidden myself quickly so that he surely couldn't see me. "Hey, little sister, have some food." The person sitting next to me suddenly became very enthusiastic, but I could clearly feel that he was intentionally or unintentionally getting very close to me. "Where do you go to school?" I moved away a little, but the other person pushed his luck. "Ivan, take these two young ones out," Atticus said in a deep voice. Ivan took the opportunity to say, "Okay. Enjoy your meal, everyone. I'll send these two back." I stood up quickly. Just as I took one step, the other person reached out and touched my leg on the backhand, which made all the hairs on my body stand on end with disgust. "In for a penny, in for a pound." I swung the wine bottle and smashed it at him. "Hiss, you little girl, you've got quite some nerve. Do you know who I am?" I roared, "I'm your father." The light in the detention center was blinding. I was sitting there, with blood oozing from my palm. The pain made me break out in a cold sweat, and I silently clenched my fist. "With that one swing of the wine bottle, you almost smashed a contract worth millions for the Chi family." Atticus looked down at me condescendingly, and his gaze was extremely oppressive. "Are you sure you can afford to compensate for it?" Thinking about my internship salary, which was only a few thousand yuan, my heart sank. Before I could say anything, Atticus asked again, "You don't expect your parents to take the blame for you, do you?" His tone was rather contemptuous, and every word was like a needle, stinging painfully. I couldn't help clenching my fist tightly, gasping in pain from it. "What's wrong with your hand?" Atticus frowned, raised his hand and grasped my wrist. Ignoring the pain in my palm, I immediately stood up, looked at him and said sternly, "Don't look down on others. Sooner or later, I'll definitely be better than you." Atticus glanced at me indifferently. He didn't say a word, but the corners of his mouth curled up in an arc. That smile was complicated. Somehow, he got some alcohol swabs, squatted down in front of me, opened my hand, confirmed that there were no fragments, and immediately pressed the swab onto it. "Ah. It hurts. If you don't disinfect it, it'll hurt even more tomorrow." Atticus gave me a glance, still pressing on my hand, but the force was a little lighter. The pain made my eyes fill with tears, and I couldn't help snapping at him, "Is this how you disinfect? It hurts like hell. I'll do it myself." "Atticus, endure it." Me. I really had nothing to say to Atticus. I'd never met anyone as unfeeling as him. It seemed that everyone was just a tool for him, and only he was the one in power. "When you took action, you were quite capable, weren't you?" Atticus held the swab and pressed it on my wound, neither too hard nor too soft. I lowered my eyes, enduring the tears in my eyes. "Are you crying already?" Atticus tore open a band-aid, lightened the force in his hand and put it on the wound, then casually wiped away the tear from the corner of my eye. I turned my face away to avoid his touch. It was late at night, and I couldn't get a taxi. I'll pay for the taxi fare. I sat in Atticus's car in silence, staring at my phone and watching it suddenly light up. It was a voice message from Aurelius. I was stunned for a second, then clicked on the voice message, and immediately a somewhat childish voice came from it. Sister, are you busy? Oh, sending a message to Sister Serafina again. The message was withdrawn in an instant. Aurelius was probably teased by his roommate and he didn't send a message for a long time. I stared at the screen, hesitating whether to send a message or not, when I noticed that Atticus in the rearview mirror was looking at me. Our eyes met. I subconsciously said, "What are you looking at?" Atticus, "The traffic lights." Me. Using the inside rearview mirror to look at the traffic lights? I didn't dare to expose him, for fear of embarrassing myself. The car stopped at the place where I lived alone. As soon as Atticus parked the car, I threw some money, opened the door and was about to run away, but Atticus grabbed me by the collar. "I'm thirsty. Buy your own water." I wriggled to run away, but since he refused to let go, I could only say in a low voice, "I don't have Bilyuakun tea at home." Atticus, "Plain boiled water will do." Me. The house was newly rented for work, and there wasn't much decoration, so it looked a bit shabby. The only bright spot was the bouquet of roses on the table. It was the bouquet chosen by Aurelius. I put it in a vase, which added a lot of color to the room. "The flowers are withered. Why don't you throw them away?" Atticus stared at the bouquet of flowers. I saw a look of dislike in his eyes and silently moved the flowers to one side. I pursed my lips and frowned. "It's none of your business." Atticus. I got up to pour him some water. When I turned around, not only was he gone, but the flowers were also gone. The next day, I saw the ravaged bouquet of flowers downstairs. What's wrong with this guy? Has he gone crazy? To be honest, I had never thought that Atticus was an idle person. In the past, I often waited until I fell asleep in his company, but I might not even be able to see him. I didn't expect that now I could see him even when taking the elevator to work. "Are you getting in or not?" Hearing someone muttering, I withdrew my gaze and silently stood at the innermost side of the elevator. I had originally wanted to settle the score with him about the flowers, but when I met his gaze, I held back and waited for the elevator door to open, then made a quick dash. However, I rushed too hard and bumped into Aurelius's arms. "Sister." Aurelius couldn't help laughing, raised his hand to support me and said softly, "We're not late yet." Pulling and tugging like this, what kind of behavior is this? Atticus's words were rather official and a bit baffling. If I wasn't afraid of him, I would have wanted to roll my eyes at him. Aurelius looked at Atticus when he heard this, and the smile on his lips was rather faint. I was just helping her. I didn't expect Mr. Liano to be so feudal-minded. After saying that, Aurelius raised his eyebrows. "Oh, I almost forgot. Mr. Liano is years old." Me. The atmosphere suddenly became strange. These two men were about the same height. Standing in the middle, I suddenly felt a bit embarrassed. "Aurelius." I didn't want to get involved in more arguments, so I could only say to Aurelius, "Let's go." Aurelius smiled gently and politely. "Goodbye, Mr. Liano." Serafina." Cassiu suddenly appeared out of nowhere and smiled at me, which made my scalp tingle. "What's the matter, boss?" I asked in confusion. Cassiu coughed twice, touched the tip of his nose with his hand and said awkwardly, "Well, for the rest of the project, let Aurelius be in charge. You and the others will be responsible for the big project together. How about that?" Why the sudden change? I was completely confused. However, Cassiu frowned and put on the airs of a boss. "Obey the arrangement." I pursed my lips, wanting to object, but since he was the boss, I didn't know what to say. "No change." Aurelius frowned unhappily and looked at Cassiu. Cassiu's face turned cold and he shouted, "Come here." Half an hour passed. Seeing that Aurelius hadn't come out of the office yet, I couldn't help feeling worried. "Aurelius, sister, Could you come and accompany me in the corridor for a while? Looking at the message sent by Aurelius, I couldn't help sighing. I guessed that he had been severely scolded and was in a bad mood. As his sister, it would be better for me to accompany him. Serafina, okay. The light in the corridor was patchy. Aurelius suddenly made a voice call, and I answered it casually. Unexpectedly, Atticus's voice came from the other end of the phone. If you weren't Cash's younger brother, would you even deserve to talk to me? She hasn't married you yet. Why can't I pursue her? My patience is limited. I hope you'll be sensible. Are you truly in love with her? There was a long silence. Aurelius said coldly, you businessmen, you marry someone even though you don't love them, justifying it as being well matched in social and economic status, as if others are just tools for you to fulfill your family obligations. Wait until you're my age before saying these things. Atticus coldly retorted, no one would want to disappoint their elders. The words stopped abruptly. This sentence was like a sharp blade, stabbing straight into my heart. I gasped for breath and stopped at the entrance of the corridor. Meeting Atticus's astonished eyes, I stepped forward and grabbed Aurelius, saw that he was safe and sound, then turned to look at Atticus and said coldly, bullying a child, what kind of ability is that? Sister, I'm okay. Aurelius lowered his voice, his eyes were red, as if he had suffered greatly, and I couldn't help feeling a bit sorry for him. Serafina. Atticus clenched his fists tightly, his knuckles cracking. I stood in front of Aurelius, looking directly at him, feeling a dull pain in my heart. Atticus, I don't care whether you deliberately came to annoy me or not. I'll put it bluntly here. If you dare to touch Aurelius, I'll fight you to the death. I don't care if it's a lose-lose situation. Atticus's eyes suddenly turned cold, and his imposing manner rose immediately. My legs felt a bit weak, but I still had to summon up my courage and said word by word, I really hate you now. But I hated myself even more. I hated that I couldn't let go once I got involved. I hated that I was so deeply trapped, and hated that even after starting over again, I would still be affected by his appearance. Which is the most painful thing in the world? Is it that the person you like doesn't like you, or that the person you like marries you but always turns a blind eye to you? Pulling Aurelius away, getting away from the air mixed with that cold and clear scent, I just felt that I completely relaxed. Sister. I turned to look at Aurelius and then remembered that I was grabbing the corner of his clothes. I hurriedly let go. Aurelius looked down at me and said seriously, Sister, I'm sorry for making you sad. I was stunned for a moment. Aurelius added, as long as you don't want to, no one can force you. I can protect you. For you, I'm not afraid of anything. I looked at him and suddenly couldn't help choking up. Aurelius reached out and pulled me into his arms. This time, I didn't resist his closeness and tears streamed down my face. The job transfer for the project was finally confirmed, and my meeting times gradually diverged from Aurelius's. I was busy all day long and the number of times we met decreased a lot. Serafina, our team is having a dinner party tonight. Do you want to join us? Yeah, it can be regarded as a celebration. Since being reborn until now, I had already attended 2 dinner parties, and each time Atticus was involved. Judging by this pattern, I guessed blindly that Atticus would be there tonight too. I asked my colleague and sure enough, he would be. So, I declined, tidied up, and took advantage of a break in the project to have dinner with Opal. Ah, well. Opal raised her eyebrows when she heard about the previous events and said, your junior has some skills. I bit the ice cream in my hand and frowned slightly. What do you mean? Opal's eyes rolled around. She hugged my arm and walked towards the restaurant, unable to hold back, and whispered softly, I heard from my brother that Liano has been in a particularly bad mood recently. No one in the office dares to talk to him. It should be because of this matter. Impossible. I directly rejected the idea. A person like Atticus might frown because of a contract 1 second and then calmly chat and laugh with others the next second. I raised my hand to push open the door of the restaurant, but unexpectedly, a person on the opposite side walked straight towards me and bumped into the door directly. Watch where you're going, you, that person pointed at me aggressively. Presumably, he was just about to swear, but when the words came to his lips, he changed his tone. Miss Song, Mrs. Atticus. I'm sorry. It's my fault. I'm really sorry. I was completely confused. Opal whispered, he's the one you threw a wine bottle at last time. I took a deep breath and glanced at the scar on that person's head. Only then did I remember it. But before I had a chance to say anything, that person called the waiter and patted his chest, saying, put Mrs. Atticus's bill on my tab. Me. This attitude was completely different from before. This person talked so much, calling me Mrs. Atticus one after another. I couldn't even get a word in. I'm not Mrs. Atticus. Do you prefer me to call you Mrs. Liano? Perhaps the name Liano was more famous than Atticus. As soon as these words came out, the boss at the counter couldn't help but look up at me and walked over with a smile to receive me in person. Forced by the situation, I took Opal and changed to another restaurant. Only then did it become quiet. Ha ha ha, it's so funny. Opal was extremely happy and hummed as she said, this is like a modern feel-good story. You don't know how arrogant that boss was in front of my brother. It really made me angry. Me. I pursed my lips and couldn't laugh. I've never married Atticus in this life. How dare that person call me Mrs. Atticus? Who gave him the guts? Atticus? What's wrong? Nothing. I shook my head, not wanting to dwell on these things. Opal was in a very good mood. From time to time, she would send messages to her boyfriend and act coquettish, with the corners of her mouth almost reaching her temples. I could tell that she was being loved deeply. Whether in this life or the previous one, she was the person I envied. Obviously, I also asked her for advice, knitted sweaters, cooked meals, and prepared birthday surprises, but why were the results so completely different? She confirmed again and again that she was deeply loved, while I confirmed again and again that I was doing useless work. The wind was strong at night. Don't be so silly. Why are you wearing so little? Opal's boyfriend arrived on time and put a coat on her. Hee. Opal tiptoed and kissed her boyfriend, making him unable to get angry. He pressed her head and kissed her hard. Me. Damn it. It's more interesting to watch others fall in love. In order not to be a third wheel, I slipped away directly, trotted to the road, and shivered in the cold wind. It's okay not to have a sweet relationship. Suddenly, there was a rumble in the sky, and the rain kept falling endlessly. Serafina? I had just bought an umbrella when I saw Atticus's mother walking towards me, and someone was standing beside her. You're soaked all over. Atticus's mother frowned, took off Atticus's coat and put it on me. Auntie, I was extremely embarrassed. Since things had already become like that, it was really inappropriate to wear his coat now. Atticus glanced at me and said in a deep voice, put it on. Me. Put it on properly. Don't catch a cold. Serafina, stay at Auntie's place tonight. It's close. Auntie, no, I've already called a taxi. Seeing that I refused to agree, Atticus's mother couldn't help asking, did you have a conflict with Atticus? I was at a loss for words for a moment. Atticus's mother had always been warm-hearted and treated me like her own daughter. If it weren't for her, I probably wouldn't have been able to endure that marriage for 3 years back then. I knew it very clearly. She didn't have a good heart and couldn't bear any shocks. When our eyes met Atticus's, I took a deep breath and said in a low voice, Auntie, don't worry. Atticus and I are getting along well recently. Atticus's mother smiled comfortably, that's good. Let's go back together. Me. I'll go to the guest room to sleep after Auntie falls asleep. I lowered my voice. Atticus, with his long-fingered hands, pulled at his tie. The broken hair on his forehead covered his sight. Until he threw the tie aside, he didn't show any intention of paying attention to me. I wasn't surprised and didn't want to say more. When it was time, I went to the guest room. The sound of running water in the bathroom continued. I stared at the scattered water droplets and just felt that my dispirited state was even worse. I didn't know if it was because I had worked too many overtime shifts and was tired. I felt so uncomfortable. After taking a shower, I dried my hair and climbed into bed early. In the middle of the night, I just felt like a puppet whose spring had been removed. My head was dizzy. Click. The door of the guest room opened. I supported myself against the wall and walked with difficulty towards the room where Atticus was. But when I raised my hand, I couldn't bring it down. I wanted to pour a glass of water to relieve myself, but I really didn't have the strength. I could only squat on the steps at the stairway. Not sleeping at night and sitting here? It was Atticus's voice. I frowned, looked up at him, stood up awkwardly, and pretended to be relaxed as I sat on the sofa. I can't sleep. Atticus left with a cold face. I leaned on the sofa, watched him walk away, then lay down completely, shivering and breaking out in a cold sweat. About 10 minutes later, there were footsteps again, but I didn't have the strength to pretend anymore. Why didn't you say you were feeling unwell? I frowned and said in a low voice, I didn't want to trouble you. Atticus touched my forehead, bent over and picked me up, as if scolding me in a low voice, I'll be driven mad by you one day. The night was dark. In the ward, I could still vaguely hear footsteps. I opened my eyes wearily, looked at the ceiling, and just felt like I was dreaming. Atticus was holding a hot water bottle in his hand and wrapping the infusion tube with it. The light in the room was dim. It shrouded his face, as if it was the last step of painting with oil paints, making the whole picture in my vision come alive. Are you still feeling unwell? Seeing that I woke up, Atticus raised his hand to touch my forehead and asked softly. I looked at him and said softly, thank you. Atticus pursed his lips and pulled a chair to sit beside the bed. I glanced at the medicine bottle and said softly, I'm already awake. You can go back. Atticus had a cold face. You alone? I looked at him silently, was stunned for a while, and replied, I'm not a child. He was quite right about one thing. I'm not a child and no one has the obligation to spoil me all the time. At least, he doesn't. Atticus's face was gloomy. He didn't say anything and didn't leave either. But I didn't dare to fall asleep again either. It wasn't until the nurse removed the needle that I curled up under the quilt. Forced by the situation, I took sick leave. I thought Atticus would leave, but it seemed that he didn't have any intention of leaving at all. He even asked his assistant to bring over a computer. The sun shone brightly. Atticus was sitting on the opposite sofa quietly reading a magazine. This scene was no different from the previous life. What was different was my heart at this moment. Are you hungry? Atticus took the initiative to start a conversation. I looked at his handsome face and watched the light fall on his brow bone. I was a bit dazed. No, I'm not hungry. I avoided his gaze. Atticus walked over. His eyes were bloodshot. He bent over to look at me. If you don't eat at noon and say you're hungry in the afternoon, I'll hang you up and beat you. I was slightly stunned and looked at Atticus in surprise, frowning. You dare, Atticus, just see if I dare. Me. I pursed my lips. Suddenly, Atticus raised his hand to touch my forehead. His fresh and cool breath rushed over me quickly and I leaned back to avoid it. Heartless. Atticus scolded in a low voice. I was lying on the bed looking at the empty doorway and my heart was beating wildly. I was so useless. Sister. Aurelius rushed over in a hurry. I was stunned for a moment. Looking at him putting down the fruits he bought, I couldn't help saying, aren't you still busy with the project? I'll work overtime at night. Aurelius took a breath. When he saw the computer on the sofa, he was slightly stunned and said in a calm voice, you're sick. I'm worried. I'm okay now. Don't run around. I looked at Aurelius, got up to pour him a glass of water, but unexpectedly, he took out a cup of milk tea instead, which was my favorite flavor. Hey! How did you? I knew you liked it, so I bought one. It's still hot. Aurelius then opened the milk tea for me. Thank you. I was a bit excited in my heart. I was still feeling uncomfortable after the infusion and had no taste in my mouth. Coming and going in a hurry, that's probably what Aurelius was like. I took a look at the price of the milk tea and transferred the money to him on WeChat. After drinking half a cup, I felt much better. What are you drinking? Atticus suddenly came back carrying something. I didn't know what was wrong with me. I subconsciously hid the milk tea. Take it out. Atticus stood beside the bed looking cold. I frowned, reluctantly moved my body, sat on the edge and continued to drink the milk tea. But before I could drink it, he snatched it away. What are you doing? Give it back to me. Atticus took a look at it and threw it directly into the trash can. I stared blankly at it and suddenly got angry. I picked up a pillow and threw it at him, shouting angrily, "Why did you throw my stuff? Don't make trouble with me." Atticus also got angry. He put down the food and scolded, "When can't you drink it? Do you have to be greedy now? Why should I always listen to you? You only care about yourself. Have you ever considered my feelings? I must be blind to like you. Wouldn't it be nice if I found someone younger than me? Why do I have to like an old guy like you?" I looked at him, my breath trembling, and couldn't help crying loudly. I cried until I choked and ran to the bathroom to vomit. Get up and eat something. Go away. Huddled under the quilt, I couldn't stop sobbing. When I thought of the grievances in those years, I couldn't help shouting, "I don't want you to take care of me even if I die." After an unknown period of time, I was hungry. I cried and poked my head out. Only to see Atticus sitting on the chair beside the bed with a bowl in his hand. "Do you want to eat?" "Humph." I frowned, didn't want to pay attention to him and took my mobile phone to order food. But Atticus grabbed me. Before I could say anything, he said, "I now believe that your being good before was all an act." Me. Search on your mobile phone by yourself to see if you can drink milk tea right after taking medicine. I frowned and silently did as he said. Looking at the search results, I didn't say anything. Atticus didn't ask any more questions. Instead, he took a spoon and handed the food to my mouth. I frowned and reached out to take the bowl and chopsticks by myself. I'll eat by myself. In the end, the scene became that Atticus served me food and I ate voraciously. "Aren't you hungry?" I ate for a while and noticed that he hadn't taken a bite. I couldn't help but ask him in a low voice, "Atticus, are you concerned about me?" Me, no. "Atticus, can't you take pity on an old codger like me?" Me. Did these words actually come from Atticus? It's really a rare sight. You know you're an old codger yourself. I bit into the food and then he raised his hand and pinched my face, which made me so angry that I bared my teeth at him. Since he paid for this meal, it was only natural that I should pay for the dinner in the evening. Don't order food randomly. Atticus still gave the warning. I pouted and rolled my eyes, then turned around and crossed out the crayfish on the menu, choosing 2 servings of wontons instead. However, when I opened the box, I was speechless. I had specifically left a note, but the boss still put coriander in it. You know, Atticus hated coriander the most. I frowned and scooped out the coriander with a spoon. What are you doing? Poisoning. Atticus. I put the spoon back in its place and lowered my head to start eating my portion. He didn't say anything and continued to clean up the coriander. I had already eaten half of mine, and he was still cleaning up. He had zero tolerance for coriander. It tastes good. Atticus suddenly made a comment. I lowered my eyes to look at my phone, feeling rather puzzled. Usually, it was me who would say such things. Finish eating and leave. Otherwise, it'll delay your company's affairs. It won't be delayed. Me. I was stunned for a moment. Holding my phone, I calmly said, "You should make plans for the wedding early. Don't drag it until the end of the year and make your mother angry." Finally, I added, "If you don't want to make your mother angry, my suggestion is that you find another girlfriend before the end of the year. Or hire someone to pretend to be your girlfriend for a while until you find the person you like. That way, your mother will feel somewhat comforted. You persuade your mother, and I'll persuade my family, and then we can put this marriage thing behind us." Atticus's eyes flickered slightly. "You've thought it through so thoroughly?" I gave him a sideways glance and pursed my lips. If I didn't think it through thoroughly, wouldn't it ruin the relationship between our 2 families? Atticus tightened his thin lips and still kept looking me up and down. "What are you looking at? When did you have this idea?" after sleeping with me. My ears turned red. I shrank under the quilt and said in a muffled voice, just think that I was young and naive back then. Atticus, then you can think that I'm also naive now. I closed my eyes and didn't know what to say. How could you be naive? Even if the sky fell, you would be the one who was best at weighing the pros and cons. Perhaps I've changed in this life, and you've also changed. But I don't want to be entangled with you anymore. On the day I was discharged from the hospital, Atticus bought me a cup of milk tea, the same kind as the one I threw away last time. I don't want to drink it now. I stared at the cup of milk tea and didn't take it. As soon as I said that, Atticus turned around and went to buy candied haws. Watching his series of actions, I felt a sense of loss in my heart. In the past, I had been looking forward to his initiative, but now that I got it, it felt like I had been slapped in the face. Before he came back, I hailed a taxi and went back to the company. People who always stay in the same place easily get tired legs and a sour heart. I, however, let it go. On the eve of the project's completion, the office building was brightly lit. Liano is here. I kept my head down and focused on my work, pretending that I was deaf. Aurelius, are you okay? I looked up when I heard the voice and saw Aurelius leaning on the chair with his eyes closed tightly and dark circles under his eyes. Although Cassio offered good benefits and the overtime pay was sufficient, the intensity of this job was really beyond what ordinary people could bear. Aurelius, I stood up and walked over. Seeing his flushed face, I hurriedly raised my hand to touch his forehead. In the infusion hall of the hospital. Sister. Aurelius opened his eyes slightly, looked at me, and then lowered his head in embarrassment. I'm sorry, I fell asleep. It's okay to fall asleep. You're so feverish that you're confused. Looking at him like this, I felt a bit helpless. If you're not feeling well, why didn't you come to the hospital? Aurelius turned his head to look at me, his eyes red, and hesitated several times as if he wanted to say something. Where else are you uncomfortable? Aurelius shook his head and said softly, Sister, I found that I seem to be a despicable person. What are you talking nonsense about? I really suspected that he was confused because of the fever. That phone call last time was made to you after I deliberately provoked him. I was slightly stunned and didn't know how to answer. I know that I can never compare to him. Even if I work overtime until I die, or even if I start a business with a loan, it's very difficult for me to reach his level. Aurelius looked at me with clear eyes and choked with sobs. But I don't want to give up. I want to give you everything you like, sister. Sister, I've liked you for a long time. Since the day of the military training when you came to bring water, I've liked you very much. Every time you came, I felt that I could stand at attention for a few more minutes. But your heart has always been on him. Sister, I'm so jealous of him. Looking at Aurelius's excited appearance, I felt a bit dazed, as if I saw myself who couldn't get the person I loved. However, I also became clearer that I had to stay sober. I couldn't accept him just because of momentary sympathy or being touched. If I did that, what would be the difference between me and Atticus? Neither of us loves the other, but we would still hurt others. Everyone has a different growth path. Don't be too hard on yourself. You'll get better and better. I hope you can meet someone who loves you and whom you loved back earlier. I thanked Aurelius for his love, but I hoped that he could find someone who truly loved him back even more. When I left the hospital, through a door, I saw Atticus. He was wearing a coat and looked travel-worn. His eyes locked onto me directly, and there was a hint of panic in his eyes. Our eyes met. I didn't hesitate and turned around to leave. I walked at a moderate pace, shutting out the sense of loss in my heart. I will walk this journey by myself. Fortunately, everything is starting anew. This time, when facing life choices, I put myself first in everything. Although sometimes I couldn't avoid running into Atticus, I became calmer each time. I could even call him respectfully, Mr. Liano. Mr. Aurelius is still in a meeting. Please wait a moment. Atticus, dressed in a suit and tie, looked up at me. Looking at the coffee I put down, he said in a calm voice, just call me an old codger. It only took a second to break my composure. I kept a straight face and didn't say anything. Atticus added, "Is that kid so delicate that he needs you to send him to the hospital?" I pursed my lips and didn't say a word. "Is this how Mr. Aurelius's employees treat guests?" I said a few words, but you didn't reply at all. I bit my lip, feeling angry, but I still held it back and said with a smile, "Helping each other among colleagues is what we should do. Atticus, come and massage my shoulders." Me. "Atticus, don't push your luck." My expression suddenly changed. Atticus looked up at me and sighed. "Perhaps it's better to say that I'm taking advantage of my age." Me. "Shameless. Come here," Atticus said again. I was too lazy to waste words with him and turned around to leave, but he directly pulled me into his arms. "Atticus." "Let go." Atticus rested his chin on my shoulder, sounding extremely aggrieved. "Just for a moment. Don't play hooligan with me." I tried to pull his hands away, so angry that I almost stomped my feet. Then he pinned me against the wall. "Don't force me to slap you." Atticus was slightly stunned, but only for 2 seconds. Then he ignored everything and kissed me. My face turned bright red. I grabbed the corner of his clothes with my hands and instinctively pinched his neck. Atticus." Atticus was panting. He let me pinch his neck, and his eyes gradually changed. "You have feelings for me in your heart." I was flustered. I pushed him away suddenly and slapped him hard. I really put a lot of strength into this slap. Atticus's red lips parted slightly. Some light fell on his eyebrows and eyes, giving him a sense of brokenness. His face was flushed. My hand was numb, and I was also stunned. I hadn't expected that I would actually hit him. "Bro, damn, you're so wild." Cassiu pushed the door open and, unfortunately, was so shocked that he was dumbfounded. I blushed and looked towards the door. Cassiu blinked, shuddered, smiled awkwardly, and quickly closed the door and left. Me. My body froze. I felt that the clear and cold aura was engulfing every nerve of mine. I trembled and wanted to run, but Atticus blocked my way. Atticus. Hit me again." "Me?" I looked at him in astonishment. I really suspected that his mind was messed up. Atticus's Adam's apple bobbed up and down. His eyes fell on my lips. He held my face and kissed me again. In the end, my legs went weak, and I was held in his arms. "Rogue, I learned it from little rogues." I glared at him angrily and raised my hand to pinch his face. "Don't pinch too hard. I still need to rely on my face to coax my wife." Atticus rested his head against my forehead and just let me pinch him. His deep eyes kept staring at me, and his gaze became more and more improper. My heart was beating faster and faster. I couldn't help scolding him. "You're shameless. Atticus, if I cared about my face, I'd lose my wife." Damn it. I hadn't realized before that he had a thicker skin than I did. This was not a place to stay long. Without thinking, I kicked him and ran away quickly. I couldn't calm down even when I got back to my seat. I have to say, Atticus cured my procrastination. In order to avoid him, my work efficiency became higher. I would quickly leave the company as soon as I finished all my tasks. For 3 consecutive days. I just breathed a sigh of relief when Cassiu organized a dinner gathering. My colleagues urged me one after another, and I didn't know what to say. After asking, I found out that the boss had sent red envelopes in the group and asked everyone to go together. "You were the only one who was in charge of that project. Now that Aurelius is on sick leave, if you don't go, who will?" Me. I held my forehead, not knowing what to do. This time, everyone seemed to have a tacit understanding. Besides colleagues, there were also some so-called big shots. The seats were quickly filled, and finally, a seat beside Atticus was left for me. Atticus looked at me, a slight smile curving his thin lips. I glared at him coldly, and he immediately stopped smiling. He leaned back on the chair and rubbed his fingertips. Before long, the dinner started. Atticus reached out his hand towards me, opened his palm, as if waiting for me to put my hand in his. I put on a straight face and put my hand on the table. Atticus would glance at it from time to time and sigh with a sense of loss. I just pretended not to hear it. However, before long, another hand suddenly grasped mine. I was startled and hurriedly pulled my hand back, only to find that the man sitting beside me was smiling at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. The next second, a cup of hot tea was directly splashed onto that man's face. Atticus stood up and punched the man. Hiss, Liano, are you crazy? The man immediately got angry and asked rudely. The two of them immediately started fighting. I hurriedly stood up and grabbed Atticus, but unexpectedly, that man punched Atticus. Atticus lost his temper and picked up the wine bottle precisely and smashed it over. This dinner party was even more chaotic than when I hit someone last time. Atticus, are you crazy? Can't you solve things privately? Honestly speaking, you're 27 years old. People in the circle who are 40 or 50 years old call you uncle, for fear of addressing you in a lower generation. But look at what you've done? Cassiu got angry in the ward. Atticus had gauze wrapped around his head and his face was a bit pale. He just let Cassiu rant and still looked indifferent. Cassiu got really worked up. That guy is no pushover. Do you still want to do business overseas or not? Usually, you're so steady, but now you're going crazy here. Don't you want to make money anymore? I don't want to make money anymore. Anyway, I can't earn it all. Atticus answered simply and neatly, which really left Cassiu at a loss. Cassiu, there's a rule that you don't start a fight at the dinner table. Atticus had a cold expression. He made a move on my woman first. Cassiu gritted his teeth, looking exasperated, and said fiercely, Atticus, I really misjudged you. You're just a lovesick fool. Me. Atticus, I'll compensate you for the losses. Cassiu's face instantly darkened, and he scolded Atticus harshly for I don't know how long. Atticus didn't refute and just let him scold. When Cassiu was tired of scolding, Atticus even asked, Are you thirsty? Cassiu left angrily. I hid outside the door, thinking that I should also leave quickly. Then suddenly my mobile phone rang. Serafina. A voice came from the ward. I frowned, wanting to slip away. As a result, Atticus pulled out the 4-needle and chased after me. Don't go. Don't go. I didn't bother to say much and directly got into the elevator and pressed the button for the first floor. However, what I didn't expect was that when the elevator door opened, a group of people were gathered at the stairway not far away. Hey, don't move. I'll go call the doctor. Everyone, step aside to let the air circulate. Quick, call the doctor. I was stunned for a moment. I really wanted to leave, but I was worried that it was Atticus. When I pushed through the crowd and took a look, it was a woman. The ambulance arrived quickly and took the woman away. I came to my senses and wanted to leave again, but I saw Atticus gasping for breath and sitting at the entrance of the hospital. Serafina, the cold wind was blowing outside. Atticus, wearing hospital clothes, walked towards me step by step and slightly stretched out his hand, trying to hold my hand. As a result, he coughed twice and passed out. Compared with my previous life, Atticus in this life is not only childish but also a bit crazy. The ward was quiet. Atticus was still sleeping. I sat beside him, looking at the faint fingerprints on his face. As the saying goes, a fall into the pit, a gain in your wit. I didn't know whether Atticus was pretending or not, but I was really puzzled. As a businessman, instead of spending time pestering me, he could completely find a new girlfriend. After some time, I was a bit sleepy and vaguely felt that I was picked up. I was a bit dazed. When I opened my eyes and saw Atticus, I immediately pushed him away. Did I wake you up? Atticus brushed aside the stray hairs beside my ear and asked softly. I had imagined this scene many times in my dreams. Now that I was really facing it, I felt sad in my heart. I was too sleepy, so I closed my eyes and ignored him. Roasted chestnuts and sugar coating. Do you want some? Atticus asked again. I found him annoying and curled up trembling under the quilt. Maybe my period was coming. I was in great pain. I sat up and looked at the bag beside the bed. Subconsciously, I took a second look and found that all the chestnut shells had been peeled off. I don't know why, but suddenly I remembered that in my previous life, I insisted on staying in his arms and feeding him chestnuts, thinking that was what a loving couple would do. But he calmly gave me a comment. He said that I was like a noisy cat instead of a dignified Mrs. Atticus. This. Atticus pushed the door open. His ears were already bright red. With a cold face, he handed me a sanitary napkin. I looked up at him in astonishment. You, Atticus pretended to be calm, looked down at me and said in a low voice, change it quickly. I boiled brown sugar water and also prepared some meals. I ate my meal with small bites while lowering my head. Noticing that someone had been looking at me all the time, I couldn't help saying, Atticus, I advise you not to waste your time on me. Atticus' expression changed slightly. He looked at me and said, eat your meal quickly. I'm talking to you seriously. I want to get back together. Atticus said this without changing his expression. I stared at him and said, no way. Atticus, then open a window. I can climb through the window too. Me. Is this really Atticus? I lowered my eyes, not wanting to talk to him anymore. Taking advantage of his going to the bathroom to wash up, I directly picked up my bag and was about to leave. As a result, the bathroom door opened with a bang, and this guy came out half naked. Serafina. You, I immediately looked away and frowned, go inside. Atticus, I won't. I couldn't help raising my hand to push him. As a result, he grabbed my wrist and hugged me into his arms, saying in a low voice, don't go. Old thing. I couldn't help snapping at him, don't be so shameless. Atticus' eyes were a bit red, his thin lips were tightly pursed. He held my wrist, tried to let go several times, but then quickly tightened his grip again. If it were someone else's face, I would probably scold him for being overly sentimental. But this face really had the charm to attract people. It's just that I wasn't buying it anymore. I can't get used to sleeping here. I'm going home. Then I'll take you home. Me. In the dead of night. I leaned against the hospital bed and looked sideways at the sofa. Atticus' eyes lit up. He looked away before I did and obediently closed his eyes. I saw that he was almost asleep, so I got up to pack my things, preparing to slip away. I had already gone out the door, but then I realized that I was too flustered and had forgotten to take my mobile phone, so I had to run back. Unexpectedly, Atticus was sitting alone on the sofa, looking at the empty room with a helpless expression. I hesitated for a moment and then pushed the door open. Atticus looked up at me and quickly got up and walked towards me. I said awkwardly, Atticus. I frowned, but I couldn't match his strength and was forcibly pressed onto the bed. As if pleading, Atticus hugged me and said in a low voice, don't go, please. About those words last time. I had never seen such a stubborn Atticus before. I was so angry that I pinched his face, but he didn't resist. I have to go to work tomorrow. I said coldly and interrupted him in a deep voice. Atticus looked at me, let go of his hands helplessly and said softly, let's add each other back on WeChat. There's no need for that. I straightened my clothes and sat up directly, looking down at him. I just felt that I was acting like he used to be. Atticus, don't waste your time on me. Serafina, I don't want anyone else. I only want you. I don't want you. I had already made it clear like this, but Atticus seemed to be as determined as an ironclad will. Since that day, I felt that Atticus seemed to have become a different person. I could see him every day after work, and he would bring different flowers to give to me each time. Is this really Atticus? I put on a cold face, took the flowers in his hand and threw them into the trash can right in front of him. Anyway, it's not me who paid for them, so I don't care. Atticus was slightly stunned. His eyes looked a bit lonely. He stared straight at me and said seriously, I have plenty of money. Me. I almost couldn't catch my breath. I wanted him to back off when faced with difficulties, but instead, he learned to rise to the challenges. Thanks to him, I learned to act like he used to. No matter how he reacted, I maintained the stance of an outsider and remained calm. But the more I maintained the stance of an outsider, the more childish Atticus seemed to become. Sending flowers, sending jewelry. The most absurd thing was sending snacks. In just about half a month. People in the office had visibly gained some weight. In the blink of an eye, it was the end of the year. Big red lanterns were hung high, and the festive atmosphere immediately emerged. "Darling." My dad walked in with a box of snacks. My eyes lit up and I was just about to go and take it. But my dad passed by me and directly went to hug my mom. He said in a tone like showing off a treasure, "Your favorite snacks." My mom was overjoyed and gave me a teasing look. "Look, Serafina thought you were calling her." "Oh, Serafina is at home." My dad was stunned for a moment. "Me? This kind of lovey-dovey scene is really everywhere." My mom sighed, looked at me a bit reluctantly and said softly, "In a few days our girl will marry into another family. Come here, let mom give you a hug." After saying that, my mom raised her hand to cover her mouth. I let out a long sigh, knowing that she hadn't given up on this marriage yet. I said calmly, "Mom, I had a dream. Do you want to hear it?" What dream?" I looked at her and said in a calm voice, "I dreamed that I married Atticus, lived in his villa, drove his car and slept in the same bed with him. Sometimes he would also buy me a lot of gifts." My mom smiled contentedly when she heard this and said in a calm voice, "You silly girl. You haven't even married him yet but you've already had this dream. When it comes to houses, cars, and gifts, has your dad ever been stingy with you?" "Yes, Dad has never been stingy with these things for me, so I don't care about them. But it's very strange. In the dream, I spent spring, summer, autumn, and winter with him, but the number of times we talked could be counted on one hand. Even the number of times we had dinner at the same table could be counted with one hand. All the gifts he gave me were chosen by his assistant. Just like what you said, Mom. He's very responsible. He's responsible for every job and is so busy that he has no time to accompany me." "Tell me, is it that he really has no time or that he doesn't want to make time?" "Mom, breaking up is a certainty." My mom's face gradually darkened. She stared at me and couldn't help saying, "You." My eyes were filled with tears and I couldn't control myself. My mom was stunned and said in surprise, "Atticus." I froze and involuntarily turned around feeling a bit embarrassed. Talking about this past event, it was really sad, but actually, my crying was just an act. The main purpose was to make my mom soften her heart. My parents quickly left the scene. Me. I have something to do. I lowered my eyes, turned around and was about to leave. But Atticus grabbed my wrist and said in a low voice, "I've always chosen gifts for others in person." I was slightly stunned and felt very awkward. Atticus handed me a bunch of candied haws and said in a calm voice, "I bought them on my way here. It just so happened that you left too quickly last time and I didn't catch up with you. If you didn't catch up, then don't bother chasing." I seldom played this kind of word game, but at this moment, I also wanted to be graceful. Atticus stuffed the candied haws into my hand, looked down at me and said slowly, "Serafina. I admit that at first, I didn't want to disappoint the elders, but I've become clearer and clearer that the reason I chose you at the beginning was that I only wanted you. That's all. Serafina, I want to marry you. I don't need you to be obedient. I'm a businessman. Without trust one can't establish oneself. I'm responsible for every word I say. I'll never make a promise easily for things that I can't achieve. You know this better than I do. Serafina, I like you." The sound of firecrackers was deafening. It seemed that snow was falling from the sky. I looked at Atticus. I would still blush when seeing him again, but finally I just smiled and said, "Atticus, thank you for your liking. I hope you can meet someone who loves you as much as you loved them earlier." I gave Atticus the same words that I had given to Aurelius. "Is it because of that dream?" Atticus stared at me intently, looking a bit bewildered for a moment. I stuffed the candied haws back to him and said with a smile, "It's just an excuse to put off my parents, Atticus. Let's part on good terms." I smiled at him with curved lips, walked past him, looked up at the snow falling outside and forced back my tears. After being reborn, it seemed that I got what I had been looking forward to in the early stage, but I couldn't tell whether Atticus's liking was real or fake. I also didn't want to guess whether I was a tool for him to please the elders. I didn't want to be uneasy in marriage anymore. All I knew was that I couldn't let myself down again. I had more important things to do. The marriage was covered by the heavy snow. In this life after starting over, I had achieved a little. I set up my own business by relying on design, and my life was quite comfortable. 3 years later, Aurelius got engaged. The other party was a junior girl of mine, who was cute and lovely. Looking at the good news in the group, I leaned on the sofa, and a familiar face came to my mind. The discomfort in my heart disappeared in a flash. Judging from how eager Atticus's mother was, he should have gotten married. Maybe he even had children already. When I went home for the festival, as soon as my mother saw me, she couldn't help feeling sad. Probably after seeing Atticus, she didn't like anyone else for me. And she was also afraid that if I found someone by myself, it would be someone she didn't like. What will you do when you get old if you don't get married? My mother sighed. Perhaps my career gave me the confidence. I was quite calm and said, getting old isn't scary. What's scary is having no money. Yes, our daughter has grown up and has her own ideas. My father chimed in, which made my mother quarrel with him again. The couple was happy, and I couldn't help laughing too. Atticus is still single. My mother suddenly looked at me. Oh. I was stunned for a moment, a bit surprised, and continued to crack melon seeds. But when I got the shells of the melon seeds that I had already cracked. Against the wind and through the snow. I went to the wishing tree again. Looking at the snow-covered tree, I stood at the position where I made a wish before and wanted to tie the wishing strip on it. Unexpectedly, my feet were too slippery and I didn't hold it firmly. I lost my own one and even pulled down someone else's. Damn it. It's all screwed up. I hurriedly picked up someone else's red strip, smoothed it out and planned to tie it on. But unexpectedly, there was a line of words written on it. If there is an afterlife, I want to marry her. Signature, Atticus. I was panting heavily. My face was flushed by the wind. Looking at the handwriting of these words, I felt a bit emotional. Your wishing strip. A familiar voice came to my ears. I froze for a second, then turned around to look at Atticus standing there. I felt a bit numb on my scalp. Because on my wishing strip, it clearly read, I'm looking for a handsome boyfriend. Left by Serafina. Atticus lowered his eyes and stared at the words above. The corners of his mouth moved slightly. He looked at me with an ambiguous meaning. Can I apply for it? Atticus rubbed the wishing strip with his fingertips. His deep and mysterious eyes were really charming. I don't want to wait for the next life.